Hi, I'm Mr. Milton, and today we're going to be talking about the economic conditions during the Industrial Revolution, specifically capitalism, socialism, and communism. Now, before we go any further, I just kind of want you to know there's going to be a lot of theory, a lot of people, and a lot of terms that you're responsible for. Now, we'll talk a lot more about the theory and the people in the class, but as far as the terms, it's probably a good idea for you to do note cards or make sure you have your definition someplace. Here are the terms that we're going to be kind of dealing with today: laissez-faire capitalism, law of self-induced competition, supply and demand, utilitarianism, socialism, bourgeoisie, proletariats, and communism. Why don't you go ahead and pause me and you can define them. I'll wait as long as you need. You just have to hit pause. Hey, nicely done. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Industrial Revolution, specifically ills during them. We've talked about the crowded housing in the tenements. We've talked about how there can be up to 20 people per room, that they can have up to 350 people using two outhouses that are sometimes backed up, and there's no sewage whatsoever. We've talked about how people share water, and with the the amount of feces in the air, that sometimes that creeps into the water supply, which then spreads things like cholera. There's a lot of issues in the early Industrial Revolution. We've also kind of talked about the high unemployment. There are more people looking for jobs than have them. This actually drives the wages down. It also makes it so, let's say, there are bad conditions at your job and you talk to your boss, you can be fired and someone can take your place very quickly. As a result, there's a lot of hungry families. Parents sometimes send their kids to work because they just simply need the money to feed them. There ends up being a very large gap between the rich and the poor, and it just gets wider. One of the other important things is the population. As we've talked about, Britain's population exploded. It went from 6 million in 1750 to 21 million in 1850. That's gigantic. That's huge. And there's going to be some serious repercussions. Thomas Malthus, he wrote an essay called The Principles of Population. He has this to say about the population. The power of population is far greater than the power of the earth to produce the subsistence of man. Why don't you go ahead and translate that? Nice job. Thomas Malthus believed that without war and epidemics, most people were destined to be poor and miserable. There was like a permanent underclass. And that was the natural state of being. It wasn't the fault of business. That's simply, what happens. The government has no business to get involved whatsoever because why should they? This is nature. Now, wait a second. This sounds very familiar. Natural state of being. Oh my goodness, this is an Enlightenment ideal. Laissez-faire is the term that means let them do as they please. Pretty much it's saying the government should get out of business. They should not regulate it whatsoever. And this is what you hear from a lot of early capitalists. They don't want the federal government, they don't want the government to get involved at all. Whenever the government gets involved, they kind of muck things up. And a lot of it's actually based upon mercantilism. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So, with mercantilism, the whole concept was that there is a finite amount of wealth in the world. And you need to make sure that your country got it. Now, how can you do that? A lot of it had to do with protective tariffs. You did not want the people in your country to buy goods from other countries. So, instead of making better products that are cheaper, instead, you put a protective tariff on it. So, remember we talked about the markers and how they're kind of like, similar markers, but one costs $1 more and you're going to buy the cheaper one? So that's what happens here. People are not going to, there's no incentive for anyone to create anything better because the government kind of picked a winner right there. Laissez-faire is saying, stop doing that. Just let it go. Let competition happen. Because the only thing that's going to fuel better products is competition. And otherwise, we're simply, getting in the way of progress. So, based on what we've talked about, go ahead and write down what the major difference between mercantilism and capitalism is. Go ahead. I'll wait right here. Now, Adam Smith is probably considered the granddaddy of capitalism. I actually don't know if he's called the granddaddy of capitalism. I might have made that up, but regardless, I'm going with it. He's a Scottish thinker. He wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations, which is supposed to be gigantic and kind of dense. He talks a lot about the unregulated markets in his 3 laws of capitalism, which we'll get to in a moment. He also talks about the power of the invisible hand of the free market. He doesn't believe that the government should pick winners and losers, which businesses are going to go forward and which are not. He wants the free market to simply decide. Well, that's interesting. Oh, here's an example. Do you know what spurred George Stephenson on to make a more efficient locomotive? It was the invisible hand of the free market. Do you know why you no longer have a VCR? It's the invisible hand of the free market. Do you know why that people no longer have those invisible dogs on leashes? The invisible hand. And you know what? Actually, in this case, I feel like the invisible hand would actually like an invisible dog. But regardless, it's gone. It was really silly. And there's no demand for it, so it went away. Which does bring us perfectly to Adam Smith's 3 natural laws for economics. The first one is the law of self-interest. People will work for their own good and will make market decisions based upon what will benefit them. Market decisions. They'll make purchases based upon what will benefit them. So people are pretty much going to buy what is cheapest and best. Now, the law of competition. The law of competition kind of stems from that. Because people are guided by their own self-interest in what they're going to purchase, you need competition to make people, or that makes competition to make businesses create better and cheaper products. This is why, at first DVD players were like $200. And then as they made better, cheaper ones, it went down in price. And now I think you get them free when you sign up for a credit card. I actually don't know that for sure, but it seems true. And then, of course, there's the law of supply and demand. Enough goods will be produced at the lowest possible price to meet the demand of the market economy. This one's a bit more, you kind of have an idea of it, but we're going to look at this one just a little more closely. So this right here is a typical supply and demand curve. You have curved up supply, and you have curved down demand. Going up is price. Going across is quantity, so the amount. So where they meet in the middle is the equilibrium, or what the price should be. So if you have more, what happens when supply increases? That means you would put a new supply curve right there. And what you would have is, since there is more supply, so the quantity is more, the price would go down. So when supply increases, unless the demand changes, the price goes down. What happens when the supply decreases? So for that, it would go further up here. And as you can tell already, right there, the price would go up as it's further up this axis. Let's do the same thing with demand. What happens when demand increases? So if demand increases, it would go right here, and price would increase as well. If demand decreases, it looks like the price would go down, which kind of all makes sense. This is the belief of supply and demand. Businesses are going to create as much as they can to make a good price. It's kind of, what drives business and what makes costs, work. It's probably why you can go to Marshall's and get last year's goods for cheaper, because there's a lot of supply and probably not as much demand. Now, I do have some questions to consider. First, how does mercantilism and tariffs hurt the economy? And base this off Smith's theories. And the second, should the United States government give tax breaks to companies? What would Adam Smith say? Think about it. There's a little picture of a fox there. I don't know why. I put that there last year. It made sense at the time, and it doesn't. Go ahead, pause me, and answer these. And maybe you can also figure out why I put a fox there, because I have no idea. This is David Ricardo. David Ricardo, he wrote The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. He believes, like Malthus, that there will be a permanent underclass. And since workers are many, then labor will always be cheap. Go ahead, why don't you make, that little supply and demand chart and explain his reasoning. Mr. Saxon would be so excited. Now, both Ricardo and Malthus, they do oppose any government help for the poor. Again, they don't think the government should get involved. If you get involved, you kind of screw up the market. The best way to cure poverty was not the government, but again, the law of free markets. Individuals should improve their lot through thrift, hard work, and limiting the size of their families. If you want to stop, a large population, you got to stop having kids. So that's very interesting.